So are just neither of you willing to work on Elon's Martian mines? Is that what you're saying?
That is what I'm saying. Yes, yes, yes. Unless I get full CRISPR-Cas9 treatment as part of my healthcare package, then we might be talking.
I don't know. If I was younger, I could imagine myself in a position where I'm like, wrestling with Elon Musk on the surface of Mars, like at the end of the first Total Recall movie.
It's easier, someone once said, to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism.
But it's clear that where we can make systems of this complexity, cultural systems, economic systems, machines of this complexity, surely we could make a world that could first meet those needs I described that everyone should have, and then perhaps meet needs that people have only dreamed of, like the need for some autonomy and freedom. The need for that little space up there, the I part, to expand a little bit. Just a little. Just a little. Just a little.
The socialism that could engage with the yearnings and dreamings
in Miles Davis music.
An aesthetic dimension.
Radically incompatible with everyday life under capitalism.
Greetings, comrades, psychonauts, amateur Adam Ray Adkins of the Acid Left, and today I am talking to Tish and Adam Turl of the Locust Review, the Born Again Lake Museum, and many other critical or realist projects.
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on. I'm Tish Turl. I'm a writer. I guess also an artist, but I claim the title writer more.
And I'm Adam. I'm an artist and historically adjunct and whatnot, and I'm one of the editors of Locust Review. And I feel like cosmically hungover, even though I didn't drink anything yesterday.
That's okay. On Saturdays, I often wake up feeling hungover from any type of exposure to the work week.
Yeah, I think it's I'm hungover. Yeah, I'm hungover from the work week, I think.
Yeah, and so Adam, you said you're an adjunct teacher. You teach art, correct?
Well, I'm not an adjunct right now. I was adjuncting for several years at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, teaching drawing and design. But right now, I'm a graduate assistant, and I'm working on another degree at the university in my hometown, SIU, which I did mostly because I thought it would be a good way to have health insurance and read books during the collapse of civilization. I'm not sure that was a good decision in hindsight, because everybody's still taking it really seriously despite the fact everything's gone sideways.
So you thought it would maybe allow you to relax a little bit more. Well, relax might be the strange word there, but to delve into, more work that of your own interest, such as what you're pursuing with Locust Review and other projects like that, but you're finding it to be actually stressful because you're having to deal with all of this on top of it as the country's gotten back to normal, this forced normality.
Right. Well, we're in impact negotiations. We're lucky to have unions for the faculty, the tenured faculty, the non-tenured faculty, the GAs, and the staff. And we have a university that hasn't really cared about. It's not as bad as it is in Florida, but they didn't have a vaccine mandate for the university until they were forced to do so. There was very little testing or vaccination on campus. And so on. So we've been trying to fight for them to take our health more seriously and the health of the students more seriously. So that's all on top of it. And then a sort of performative normality that is expected, and I know Tish has experienced this too, where, like people are talking about like, we're planning for the future and let's just forget about the pandemic, or, that we're 7 or 8 years away from climate catastrophe, and so on. And so it becomes a bit disjointed. Like you feel like you're crazy, but really it's the environment around you that has gone mad.
Yeah, no, it's like I keep having these like other undergrads and stuff because I'm back at SIU to get my bachelor's in creative writing, and I keep having these other students who like both don't know like anything about like some of the scarier stuff that's like happening in the world right now, and also are just like really excited to go to like unmasked student events because they want like a return to normalcy, and I'm like, I'd rather not die so you all can get a photo with fucking Saluki.
Which is our mascot.
I saw that picture. He's kind of frightening looking.
He's terrifying, right? Yeah, that's the unapproachable one. There's one that's more cartoony, but it's still terrifying.
You got the two faces.
Yeah. The cartoony one is like the first couple dates with the Saluki, and then like then after your third or fourth date, it turns into the other one. But Tish, didn't you bump into a fan of the Acid Left the other day on campus?
I did. I was at Starbucks just getting my coffee so I could be awake enough for my fiction class, and I was wearing the Acid Left shirt that we got, and the person behind the counter was like, "Oh my god, I love your shirt." And I was just like, "Yeah, it's a great shirt. You know, you should check it out. This is my friend's podcast." And he was like, "I know. I'm a fan. I love that." I'm like, "Oh, okay,
wow.
cool." Yeah.
That's wonderful.
It was a really awesome moment.
We speak to the baristas in Illinois. I'm about that. But something you said, Tish, actually made me think when you're talking about the students, you know, these younger undergrads not knowing about some of the dangers in the world and wanting to party. You know, that's a lot of, you know, especially undergrad life is that. It's going out, partying, socializing. But at the same time, it is where a lot of people do become radicalized. You know, I actually didn't attend college, went to a lot of
parties at the local art school.
And had a lot of those conversations. That's where I learned about a lot of theory, is talking with these people and like discussing the greater stuff going on in the world. So I feel like it is, obviously I want everyone to be safe, and I take many precautions to not to go out and all these things, and I don't think we should be doing large unmasked parties, but also there is that potential for socialization and discussing and actually making connections that you wouldn't otherwise get. So you have a real problem today. This need to go out and socialize is kind of at a real tension with, you know, the threats that can lurk everywhere. But there's also that threat of, if we don't connect with our communities, with our fellow students, with our fellow workers, if we're not making those bonds, and we risk this atomization and individualization. So yeah, it's a tough world to navigate, and I do feel bad for students and teachers at this moment.
Yeah, no, it's like, yeah, you're right, because like I keep thinking like I don't want to be in these rooms, but like the number of opportunities I've had to like have conversations with like 18, 19, 20 some year old kids who are like, you know, who haven't considered some of the stuff they're being forced to do right now, and like saying things to them that make them go, oh shit, actually, like it is nice, even if it's like terrifying and I have to, you know, there's a risk involved in doing it. You're right.
Yeah, like it reminds me, sometimes I really dislike my job, but I also think about the ability to show some of the people there and, you know, agitate there and, you know, push for pro-union ideas and stuff like that, because I live in a very anti-union state and work for a very anti-union company, even though for several years now that threat has been on the horizon to them. They strongly push against it, and many of the people are, you know, anywhere between 16 and 25 and don't understand even what a union is. So when the company says, oh, there's this, you might be hearing about these things called unions, and you should really know that they're terrible. You know, we get anti-union propaganda mailed to us by the CEO and stuff like that. it does feel good to be able to give a counter narrative to that to my fellow workers.
Yeah, you're making me realize too that. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Tish.
I was just gonna say, you're making me realize that, like, as an undergrad, like, I'm way less beholden to the admin and stuff. I really could quote unquote poison some minds in a more effective way than like a GA could. So thank you for the inspiration.
Real corrupting media towers.
I think there is like such a disconnect because right now we're having this like mini strike wave happening and a tightening of the labor market, which is contradictory because there's also the inflation. And so some working class people are feeling emboldened, but then like the transmission belt of the history and knowledge of class struggle has been broken in a lot of ways. So, I mean, I even remember, this is a little over 10 years ago, there was a strike at Northeastern Illinois University, and I was helping out with some students that are doing strike solidarity, and we noticed that almost all the students supported the strike, but then planned to cross the picket line. So we wrote a little pamphlet and we printed it up and handed out like a couple thousand of them about what is a picket line, explaining that it's not just an abstract symbolic thing, whatever the union bureaucracy says, you're not supposed to cross it, because that undermines the effect of the strike. I think that another thing that's really frustrating is there's a long history of like sort of like constructive decadence and overlap between like the bohemian and the working class movement. I don't know if there's a book by Proletarian Nights that talks about the overlap between the labor movement in Paris and bohemian in Paris, the artistic movements. And a lot of that was like staying up all night, drinking and smoking and talking about ideas and politics. And that's obviously an important part of socialist and labor struggle. And it overlaps too with something that's contradictory, I think. We were talking on the Locust Review podcast with the poet Richard Hamilton about this, of like working class nihilism, sort of an acceptance, a frustrating acceptance of things that aren't going to change, so you might as well say fuck it. Fuck it. So you might as well say fuck it.
Fuck it. Fuck it.
And that can be progressive and it can be reactionary depending on the situation. Although I don't really like the word progressive because it implies a teleology of progress. But and I'm usually pretty sympathetic to that. Like, it's pretty on a gut aesthetic level, and it's frustrating not to be in those spaces since I'm older and immune compromised, hanging out till 3 or 4 in the morning, drinking and talking politics and art with folks the way I would have until recently. So I don't have the answer to that. We're trying to create like a space here, but the pattern of the pandemic will bear out how that moves forward partly.
I'm also reminded of in Germany, the SPD had, and the socialist parties had all of these clubs. They had beer halls and and then it would go into things other than just drinking and smoking and having a good time. They would have like gun range clubs, which you see popping up kind of in the U.S. now among leftists, but also sports clubs.
Right.
Maybe they would go rock climbing. Maybe they would go skiing and stuff like that. And that social aspect is incredibly important for movement building and for individual mental health. Like, we are social creatures, so to have a strong community and society that you feel like you're working towards something beyond yourself is inherently good, I feel like. Before we get too much further into this, I wanted to talk to y'all about Locust Review. I'm sure many of our listeners have seen it. They've at least seen us post about it on Instagram or Facebook with either subscribers. But to anyone who is unfamiliar, Locust Review publishes short stories, artwork, fiction, essays, reviews, poetry, and it comes in a quarterly and as a kind of newspaper style print in black and white, and it is It's one of my favorite publications, quite honestly.
Well,
And
thank you.
I don't say that simply because I've been published in it multiple times. I really do enjoy the layout, the look of it, and the messaging. It kind of has this very 70s punk zine feel to it, but also heavily rooted in a sci-fi ethos. But it's not just sci-fi. It has this criticalness to it. It has a very grounded socialist and radical message, even when it's being more absurd or abstract, which, you know, I think is part of the larger project that y'all are pushing forward. In the first issue, you talk about critical realism, and I was wondering if you could say something about that, maybe explain what critical realism is, and perhaps what led to the creation of Locust Review.
In 2019, Tish and I and Alexander Billet, who we had worked with at Red Wedge magazine, Holly Lewis, a writer and philosopher, and then Mike Lineweaver, who's a poet in Texas. We decided to start a journal, and we borrowed the critical realism concept from Michel Louis, the French-Brazilian sociologist and philosopher. And a realism basically refers to any like cultural gesture or artwork or narrative that rejects realism. It's like realism, which includes, of course, things like science fiction, magical realism, surrealism, some absurdism, and a number of different cultural things. And critical realism uses that realism as a kind of a means of estrangement, like in a Brechtian sense, to create critical distance so that you can use the irreal to criticize the quote real, right? And we saw this, we really gravitated towards critical realism because of our opposition to capitalist realism. The concept, articulated by Mark Fisher, that it had become increasingly difficult in neoliberal capitalism to imagine coherent alternatives or imagine beyond the limits of capital accumulation. And we saw this as something that was detrimental both to the political horizons of socialists and radicals and working class and oppressed people, but was also damaging to self-expression and art and culture. That it was creating a dull, prosaic realism that actually acted as an apologetics for capitalism. You think, in particular, like, for example, prestige television shows with anti-heroes that are sort of like an elaborate apologetics for, the brutality of the system. Like, what else could you do? Tony Soprano might be complete shit, but blah, blah, blah. So that was kind of like part of our initial impetus. Another part of it was seeing that there was far-right realism growing, responding to the limits of capitalist realism, but in a reactionary and increasingly fascist way. And we've seen this cohere around things like QAnon, conspiracies, and so on, that respond to real things in the world, but in an inverted way. Like, while kids are being rounded up at the border by ICE, creating an elaborate anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that
Global elites are kidnapping children for their adrenochrome.
and so on. The last thing I'll say about it is we wanted it to have like this sort of, there's other things we wanted in terms of the form of it. We wanted to have what we've called like a differentiated totality, and we're trying to do that more and more with each issue, where there's more subjective voices that are critical, mixed in together. So this is what the poet Richard Hamilton calls discordant will. It's on the one hand a unified set of voices against capital and oppression, but it's not reductive. Is the goal, right? And we also wanted to both use the digital and the analog, so the handmade as well as the computer made, in an alternating kind of way, to hit at the Gothic aspect of how culture is experienced, to move back and forth between politicization, and aura, like in the sense Walter Benjamin talks about the auric cult value of a work of art, which is why we wanted to print issue not just to create a website, which is largely what we did with Red Wedge. It's largely a website, although we had periodic criticisms there.
I guess basically like what I have to say in favor of critical realism is that like I think that it holds fuel for your imagination to like imagine something better, but it also holds a lot of potential for like the anger and the revenge that I think we all would like.
Somewhat like the early surrealists, it seems more a devotion to a mode of production rather than an aesthetic ideal. It's not a genre per se. Genres can fit into it. It's not, this look critical irrealism. You have to engage with both the form and the content to decide if it's critical or realist.
Definitely. And in fact, part of what we want is, if there is an aesthetic unity, it's the push and pull of it not being completely unified.
Right, the way each issue almost looks like a mosaic in and of itself. Like you could be standing far back, theoretically, and see something and then come up to it, and there are all these unique voices, unique styles within it, which, is something I try to do with my own artwork, and I think, Adam, you do that as well with your artwork.
Yeah, that's one of the things Tish and I try to do in the Born Again Labor Museum. And I think it's this idea of like a differentiated totality or discordant will that cuts both against the vulgar Marxist reductionism. Is like our comrade Anupam Roy is another editor at Locust Review put it.
The muscular guy with the sickle standing up top of the Stalinist building or whatever.
But also against the sort of post-structuralist rejection of a unified set of interests amongst the exploited and oppressed, and we can express that in our work, like visually and conceptually. But ideally, that work also needs to be in connection with other people's work, right? Because of the impossibility of representation, right? Like, I can imagine certain kinds of ways of experiencing capitalism and oppression, but I only know really know phenomenologically the ones that I know. But if we can get lots of different voices together, we can hit on all the notes, or more of the notes, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And as you engage those other voices, your very consciousness, as it were, is changed a bit, right? You can't truly encounter another voice, another experience without being changed yourself.
Right.
So you mentioned Red Wedge, which Locust Review in some ways was born out of. What's the difference between Locust Review and Red Wedge? Why start Locust Review and not just continue Red Wedge?
I guess if I had to like label a difference between the two, I think Red Wedge was a lot more like theory, whereas Locust, which is not that there's anything wrong with that, but like Locust focuses more on creation rather than theory.
I think there was two big things. One is exactly what Tish said. I mean, Locust is focused more on praxis, and Red Wedge over time became more focused on theory. And in part it made sense. We started, actually a group of comrades, mostly but not entirely, who were part of the now defunct ISO, International Socialist Organization, started Red Wedge, I think, in 2012. And then in 2013, I came on as an editor after I wrote a letter to Red Wedge disagreeing with their analysis of romanticism, which is kind of anyway esoteric. But they basically repeated the old Marxist trope that romanticism was inherently reactionary, a couple of writers. And I wrote in saying that I thought that Michel Louis' approach was better, that it was contradictory, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I came onto the editorial board. But we sort of developed an idea at Red Wedge over the years. And this is, of course, before the New Socialist movement takes off in the U.S. in 2015-16, right after Occupy, that we were trying to create a sort of ecumenical space, a sort of aesthetic left regroupment, I guess you could say. We would look at all the different historic socialist art movements and avant-gardes and try to bring the ideas of those back to sort of sort them out and introduce those to the people who read Red Wedge. And we put this under the rubric of
what we call an approach to a popular avant-garde, an avant-garde that
is not elitist, but neither is it against
theory
or aesthetic innovation, experimentation, and so on.
So we would look at Brechtian theater, surrealism, constructivism, Mexican muralism, Mexican muralists, and the theater of the oppressed, and on and on and on. Things from the feminist art movement in the 1970s, the Black Arts movement, and try to bring all this stuff to the foreground, and then various analyses of popular culture. I think one of the things that happened is that as we ended up with an actual socialist movement, such as it is in the United States, that ecumenical approach, while it had a lot of great stuff about it, and I think it's still worthwhile, some of us developed a much more serious opposition to capitalist realism, and seeing that as a central problem in terms of the imagination and cultural work. And we wanted to do a journal that was more focused on praxis. Not that we don't think theory is important. We have a theory annual now at Locust. Once a year we publish a theory annual, Imago. In addition, of course, we talk about theory a lot on our podcast. But we wanted to be more focused on praxis and more focused on this opposition to capitalist realism and creating work for our working class, socialist, and anarchist audience.
When I give someone, because I'm a subscriber to the Patreon of Locust Review, and I get 4 issues every month, so I keep one for myself, give the other 3 away.
What I tell people is, I usually highlight first and foremost art. I tell them, oh, it has art, like look at it, and they'll flip through and I'm like, oh yeah, this looks great. And I'll say, yeah, and there's some poetry and short stories in there. And then, I'm picking who I'm giving this to. And then eventually I'll say, oh, and it's pretty radical. It's like grounded in a socialist vision. That's special, I think. It doesn't feel like you have to be a socialist or even a leftist, really, to appreciate on its face Locust Review. So, and I think that's something that we should be doing. It's, I think, a reason that some of the anti-capitalist art that becomes very large and mainstream, a lot of the times that art, that's what it accomplishes, in my opinion, is it feels like art first and foremost. It doesn't feel like propaganda. Whereas if you look at something that's directly made to give you a straightforward political message, you already have to agree with that message in order for it to strike you.
I appreciate that assessment, because one of the things that I think that excites me the most about Locust is how every time I pick up one of our issues, there's like an authenticity to it. Not that I appreciate that word, but that's a big thing for my generation, and I know younger generations, is like quote unquote authenticity. Like, it doesn't feel like you're being talked at by people. Like, it's not hello fellow working class, it's like it's like made by people who are like you, so you're able to like see yourself in it.
Right.
Hello, fellow workers.
Yeah.
And
there's a humor to it, Like,
Yeah.
You're not gonna see most socialist papers have pictures of dinosaurs with strap-ons in them.
Oh, thank you. I drew that.
That was a Tish original. I collaged it.
Yeah, I like that. It's a wonderful image that is very jarring, and it's very in line with today's youth that would want to see something like that, right? It has both a transgressive and irreverent style to it in a sense, but you also feel like there's something more there too. Seeing someone with a strap on now is not the most uncommon, especially with the popularity of the word peg. And now the dinosaurs coming back to peg humanity, it just feels appropriate somehow.
Oh, that is so gonna be a piece of stink ape. Thank you.
I think I just wanted to add something to that. I mean, I'm not against propaganda, but I think a lot of times the best propaganda comes organically from social struggles. I moved to St. Louis 2 weeks before the Black Lives Matter movement exploded in Ferguson. after the police murder there. And, you know, I went to a few protests and so on, but it was very clear to me that I wasn't going to make propaganda that was better than what was coming out of that struggle. And, you know, I think like one of the things like Ernst Fischer, the Marxist art critic, who tried to apply the Marxist analysis of the origin of human beings, you know, the origin of the family, private property, and the state, and argues that like art is both a social as well as existential thing, right? Like, so for me, like for art to be good art, it needs to deal with the phenomenology of the majority of human beings at some level, and the majority of people are exploited and oppressed. If art is a human necessity, then art needs the art that is, especially art that is made by and for working class people, needs to deal with the phenomenology of the exploited and oppressed subject. And there's a humor to there's a humor to that. There's a pathos. There's tragedy. There's trauma. There's revenge. There's class consciousness. And coming at it from an Irrealist point of view allows you to talk about some of those things, I think partly without recapitulating the trauma of living in this world. Like just a realistic thing about like, you know, what it's like to have to live in your car. I mean, there's a usefulness to that, possibly, but it can also just reinforce the helplessness and the despair that we already feel.
Right, and I think, actually speaking just on that example too, especially at a time when we are shown, you know, a glorified and sanitized bohemian lifestyle of living in your car, you know, and
Hashtag van life.
right, yeah, hashtag van life. And I mean, I think there is something appealing to that. There's a reason why it is caught on so strongly, and it's that people want desperately to reject this mundane and stifling world of the 9-to-5 work job that people are living in. You know, so many of working class jobs are redundant, useless, poor paying, it hurt your body. And there's also this sense that, like,
you know, we might not have much longer on this planet, so
we might as well,
do this. Might as well have fun time while the world burns.
Which I think is a sad reaction, but I think it is a reaction that's grounded in a real possibility. You know, instead of working to perhaps not allow the world to burn.
Well, it's like the moneyed reaction to the world burning, whereas it sort of reminds me, since your assessment of it as like an escape, it reminds me of the TikTok phenomenon of like people dissociating purposefully, you know.
There's also this strange pop psychology or pop psychiatry that goes on TikTok where, people, there's like almost this transferable mass hysteria of people mimicking mental disorders such as dissociation and stuff like that. Which is actually sad and strange the way that works. Or another one that's come about is people mimicking and tricking themselves into believing that they have Tourette's and stuff like that.
I have seen some of that.
Yeah. There's like doctors in certain areas that are documenting it, like spikes of kids coming in, and and these people are trained to understand how Tourette's, works, and they can diagnose it. And they're like, no, they do not have it. They are clearly mimicking it, but they're mimicking it unconsciously to a level because they've consumed this content. So it shows like this way that the internet can kind of change our neural feedback loops.
Yeah, I can't go on TikTok without
being diagnosed with ADHD and CPTSD about every 5 minutes.
And it's interesting to me because like those are from what I know about those disorders, they can look sort of similar. So like I'm also like I wouldn't be surprised that like most people under a certain age would be showing symptoms of ADHD/CPTSD because like
what those symptoms tend to look like that you see in the TikToks are like trauma responses.
like it's the most traumatic time of these people's existences. Of course they're showing trauma responses. And so it made the whole reaction like of mental illness make sense to me because it's like, oh, this is more of these people trying to make sense what's happening in the world around them.
I mean, there's obviously a class aspect to the idea of individual escape, and there's also a class aspect to the idea of collective escape. I think it's related to something I wrote about in Imago about kismet versus social kismet, individual fate versus the idea of collective fate. And I think one of the ideas around Locust is, do you disassociate or shift critically? Rather than just not that I blame anyone we're trying to like mentally disengage from the world as it currently is. But one of the things like Tish does in Stinkape Resurrection Primer, the series that they're working on right now, is these Irrealist vignettes that on the one hand reflect the trauma and tragedy of this world, but then also reflect things like class revenge. So like some like alien bounty or whatever, like shooting up a group of landlords at the space cantina or whatever. I think that one of the things that, again, this goes to like breaking capitalist realism and the stymieing of our imaginations, is a lot of the classic critiques of the cybernetic, and this is something we're talking about a lot in the editorial for Locust 6 that just got printed, is the infringement on individual subjectivity, where you stop and the computer, the machine, or the algorithm begins is made unclear. And one of the things we sort of try to like imagine against this is asking, what are the machines? They're dead labor. They're the accumulated wealth produced by our ancestors in terms of the working class. What if instead of seeing them as solely the tools of capital, they're also our ancestors? What if there's a gothic quality to the cybernetic in which, if we imagine solidarity with the machines, they actually could do something completely different than what they're doing to us right now? Anyway, so I think that part of the difficulty we have, I mean, there's the specific hangovers of the 20th century in terms of how we're organized politically, but again, it goes back to this difficulty in imagining beyond the limits of capitalist realism. One of the things I have noticed in our left organizations is, you comrades will all agree, we're facing climate catastrophe in 7 or 8 years, but then most of the proposals about what to do are repeats of the same old thing. Just elect a few more city council members, or we'll recruit 5 or 6 more people to a high level understanding about Leninism or something. Neither one of which is going to do anything in the next 7 or 8 years to stop what's happening.
We're imagining too small.
Bo Burnham's last special, Inside, which many people took to be a direct response to the lockdown. And I mean, obviously there's elements of that in there. That's what led to it. But I think the cornerstone of it is this song, That Funny Feeling, where he says, in it, he says something like 20,000 years of this, 7 more to go. And that's the crux of the whole thing, is this depression and anxiety that he's documenting throughout it, for me, is not directly pandemic related. It is about the larger looming catastrophe of climate crisis and of watching what's happening with neural rewiring of children's brains.
I think another moment that gets at that too is the part of the song near the end. You say the ocean's rising, like I give a shit. You say the whole world's ending, honey, it already did. Like, I think that's another like summary of sort of what he's saying in there. Yeah,
it's so clear that it's there, but so many people that would not have considered themselves leftist or probably most apolitical people find it a lot to relate to, and with their mental health and their understanding of the world. And I think that's an important thing to bring to people.
I think that in a lot of ways the pandemic is a dress rehearsal for climate crisis. And it's not like the bourgeoisie. I don't think the capitalist class is united on how to deal with this. I think there are divisions, a tension between, for example, mitigation at a most minor level so that status quo can be maintained in terms of capital accumulation, people showing up for work, etc. And then let it rip, right? Just let the exterminism happen, let the people die. And I think this is also reflected like what's happening in Congress right now, and around the job, the worker shortage, because there isn't really a worker shortage so much as there's a crisis of social reproduction. Because if you look at the numbers in terms of the people who are opted out of the workforce, which is creating the difficulty in filling lower income jobs, is almost entirely women with children. And one of the things that the Biden administration was trying to do is ease getting those children into childcare and so on to get those women back in the workforce. That's realizing there's a social reproduction problem in terms of getting people back to work. The opposite point of view is, of course, screw it all, just let everybody die. It doesn't matter. The sort of fatalistic death cult side of capitalism that's happening at the same time. So I think we'll continue to see this kind of pattern bear out as more and more crises happen, moving closer to climate catastrophe, of small mitigations so capitalism can continue to function as it has versus just let it rip. Just let people die.
Because at the top often feel like they've got their justifiably, so their survival is their reward.
And they have their own private Elysiums to run off to, like Ted Cruz when Texas went dark. You can fly off to your own resort, or some protection. To what extent, climate change is an existential crisis for everyone, regardless of social class, is not clear yet.
So are just neither of you willing to work on Elon's Martian mines? Is that what you're saying?
That is what I'm saying. Yes. Unless I get full CRISPR-Cas9 treatment as part of my healthcare package, then we might be talking.
I don't know. If I was younger, I could imagine myself in a position where I'm wrestling with Elon Musk on the surface of Mars, like at the end of the first Total Recall movie. Eyeballs getting big. I mean, we did that collage painting where we had Alita, the Queen of Mars from the 1924 Soviet movie, and also the Tolstoy novel, beheading Elon Musk.
We did this earlier when you said that you were trying to build a space where you are these types of ideas proliferate in the actual world, not just in print media or online. And I think you're referring to the Born Again Labor Museum, which I've been seeing pictures of for some time,
but now it is, or of the pieces that would be included in it, but now it is being made into an actual physical location. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I'm sure I can introduce it a little bit. Mostly, I'll just talk about sort of the space that we found. It's this sort of run-down, ridiculous-looking, painted black and white space in an old sort of like strip mall kind of an area here in Carbondale, and it I don't know. I think it used to be like an old accounting office, and then eventually like a head shop / daycare, because there's like rainbow letters. Yeah, no, I mean it's fantastic, and we'd had so much stuff like building up in the house that we really like needed a space, and it is coming together. There's a room in it that someone apparently tried to like pick through the wall into the space next door. I'm not really sure, but that's a piece of art now.
Yeah, we want to be able to use it. We've talked to like the local DSA chapter about like maybe we can do events and so on there. And there's other things we want to be a sort of a site of practical and impractical solidarity. So we're building up agitprop materials, both Irrealist and practical, that can be borrowed, loaned out, and so on. But we've created a series of artworks and artifacts, and it's supposed to be an environment that we sort of got inspired by, the concept when Walter Benjamin talks about basically the revolutionary generation redeeming all previous generations of workers, the exploited and oppressed. It's an adaptation of a theological concept, because of course Benjamin had been a theologian before he was a Marxist critic. It's the concept of apokatastasis, the redemption of lost souls. So we thought of what if we had tried to build a museum that was, from our point of view, a museum of the dream life of working class people throughout history. Obviously, that's an impossible task. So we've mined, of course, history and theory and so on, and we're creating works for it, artifacts, wounded tools, paintings, collages, sculptures, and so on. It's also like kind of inspired by like ideas around Russian cosmism, which had an influence on the early Soviet avant-garde. And cosmism was this esoteric philosophy around this guy Nikolai Fedorov, who passed away in 1904, if I remember right. And he was a librarian in Moscow, and he didn't actually publish much during his life, but his followers published his material after his death. And it had a big influence on people like Kazimir Malevich, and it influenced people like Vladimir Tatlin, Malevich being the painter, Tatlin being the sculptor who famously did the monument to the Third International, as well as like other Soviet avant-gardes. And the idea behind cosmism was sort of twofold. That one, human beings should dedicate all their resources toward achieving immortality, and conquering death and decay once and for all, which he saw as a fusion. And then after that happens, should figure out how to resurrect all the previous generations of human beings. And he saw this was necessary through a fusion of art and science. Art to sort of like find the performances of the people that come before to help bring them back, and also create environments that wouldn't be alien and hostile to them when you brought them back. So you'd have to create a space for when you resurrected hunter-gatherers that wouldn't freak them out, and so on, until they got acclimated. But also science, that all science should be dedicated toward this. And this sort of captured the imagination of some avant-gardes. And the reason it's called cosmism was because he thought space travel was necessary to make this happen. One, because you'd have to track down the cosmic dust of the ancestors after it had spread through the universe, theoretically. And also because once human beings were immortal and everyone had been resurrected, you'd need lots of planets for everybody to live on. So taking this as a sort of cultural notion and a realist sort of gesture, although Fedorov meant it completely literally, like what can we do to create an environment where like there's this idea, these ideas cut so much against capitalist realism, but they also cut against the nihilism of the fascist realisms that we see today, that are so tied to the death cult of capitalism. So that's sort of like where we started with these kind of ideas, and then we've been elaborating on it in this sort of evolving group of artifacts and artworks that's a total installation that, is never meant to be complete. It's meant to violate the principle of completion in art. It's supposed to continue to evolve. So we're hoping to have it open sometime around the holidays. How open it will be will depend partly on where we're at with the plague, I think. Ideally, we'd just invite everybody in town to come, but if the plague is still a major consideration when we do open, that won't be possible. But
I think the pieces that most initially stood out to me from that were the wounded tools, where you have these like old rusty cheese grater wrapped in lines of poetry with blood on it and stuff like that. They're just highly moving images. And then imagining this as a space that you could actually walk around in and examine is, I think that's there's just something so powerful about that. And it's, part of it is the physicality of it all, but it's also different than your typical, gallery or museum. It's, I don't mean this as an insult, I promise. It's almost like a version of like the Meow Wolf phenomena, which like these giant installation art places. Of course, we know now that they are extremely anti-union, despite whatever aesthetics and stuff like that. But that's what I think speaks to people and touches them on a deep level, is being able to have the immersive experience. And people that wouldn't want, like, there's a lot of people that would view, a lot of working class people that would view going to a contemporary art gallery as either pretentious or just plain bored, and stuff like this kind of breaks out of that and is a lot more lively, touches on more levels, and it's like intellectual. I have an art history degree, so I know and appreciate this stuff. But it also makes me think like that what you were saying about that Russian, I believe it's Russian, conceptual art piece installation of like the man who flew into space from his apartment. It's beautiful. Like, it's like this apartment room covered in old Soviet space propaganda photos, but then someone like built this contraption, this like springboard next to the bed, and there's a hole in the ceiling, and you can feel so much about it, and it has this true optimism of like bringing this the militaristic dreams of Soviet Union into the everyday life of the working class Soviet worker. Yeah, and just shows the true optimism. I also think that this cosmism that you described and bringing everyone back to life and stuff, I find that incredibly intriguing, even on a realistic level. Like, I don't know, if that were a church in town that I could join, and I might get baptized finally.
No, that you're talking about an installation by Ilya Kabakov, and Boris Groys theorized it as a total installation. This immersive sort of narrative conceptual art, which was opposed to conceptual art in the United States, which was not focused on narrative, but was focused on definition. There's that famous piece by was it Joseph Kosuth, I think it's The Three Chairs, where there's a picture of a chair, an actual chair, and a definition of a chair on the wall. So this very semiotic approach to conceptual art, whereas in Eastern Europe you have this very narrative, Eastern Europe and Russia have a very narrative approach to conceptual art, which is one of the things that led to us wanting to do Bomb. Another thing was thinking about using the art space as a theatrical space, like in a Brechtian sense. Danica Radosevich wrote a wonderful piece back at Red Wedge in 2015. She's an artist, I think in Colorado now, where she compared she basically described the White Cube Gallery as sort of a physical manifestation of bourgeois ideology, connecting it directly to the German ideology by Marx, because it decontextualizes, it removes the image or the artwork from the social reality and floats in an empty space, right? Which reinforces what I think is a contradictory kind of fetishism, a fetishism on the one hand underlying the importance of human performance in the art object, but also commodity fetishism and bourgeois ideology. And creating a theatrical total installation cuts against that, it recontextualizes the objects in relationship to each other. So if you have a mass-produced object next to an art, like a quote-unquote traditional crafted art object, those things become in conversation with each other and begin to reestablish something like the social, or a reflection of like the social totality. But we were also influenced by the last thing, outsider art, which is an elitist conception that actually doesn't explain the artwork involved, except its separation from the mainstream art world. But if you look at a lot of outsider art, one of the things that those artists are concerned with is social totality. They have either a philosophical, theological, or social worldview, sometimes not a good one, but their work campaigns around that and tries to establish that in this sort of obsessive, repetitive, but differentiated way. So we were inspired by some of that as well, in trying to create this sort of evolving museum space. And you're totally right. Polls have borne out that the majority of people don't want to go to art galleries. Maybe they'll go to art museums, but not art galleries, because it's so intimidating and outside the realm of everyday life. So one of the things we want to do, and it's one of the reasons it's taking us a while to get this thing started, is we want to have places where people can just sit and be, you know, like, and in a comfortable way, you know, not in a, you know, uncomfortable way. So we have to, like, we're looking at like old restaurant booths that we can get for cheap and stuff like that to like splatter around the space so people can just be there. Again, all of this is contingent on plague dynamics.
So a lot of this also relates to something Mark Fisher talks about in his unfinished introduction to acid communism,
Right.
Which is the psychedelic space, and that's kind of maybe what something like this could function as. It's like a meeting ground for people, and the psychedelic space could have been like a commune, but it could have just as easily been what we might call a venue of some sort. You know, it could have been an art gallery. It could have been a place where people regularly go to practice music and stuff like that. But the point was that when you entered it, you were brought into an area which kind of changed your normal functioning. Of course, the artwork, sounds that around you are operating on your body in a certain way, but also social class distinctions are kind of flattened out when you're in that kind of space, and you're able to reevaluate your life and your connection with others and your connection with broader cultural and productive systems in the world. Many of these things operate by, like you said, maybe working with the DSA or other activist groups, allowing them a space to operate within. So a meeting space for people, but then also a space for relaxation, and kind of bringing those two worlds together can be really important and help build a community. I think of there was this old thing called granges that were in the U.S. They're not very much around anymore, but they almost operate like a Masonic hall would, except they were decidedly more agrarian and most more egalitarian, allowing women as well, and kind of erasing that space between man and woman in the broader community. The few granges still have it, and they do still hold this space in their community. The Anarchist Art Collective, the Design Collective, actually up in Maine, bought and restored a falling apart grange, and they used it for, you know, their own activities, but also just broad communal activities, things that are not related to anarchist theory or, you know, like activist organizing and stuff like that, but having, you know, a jazz concert for the community to come, where senior citizens and children and, you know, wayward crust punks can all gather and dance together, and that's important.
Yeah, we need more spaces like that, because like there aren't really spaces for people to go to that don't cost money and aren't like heavily monitored by just like the standard cameras and shit. That's really cool. I hope that we get to do something even like half as cool as that with Bong, because it would be really nice to create a space for people to go to and create in.
When I was much younger, I dropped a decent amount of acid and ate a number of magic mushrooms from like 15 to 20-ish. Well, I stopped when I started having panic attacks and so on. But I remember I grew up in the middle of the woods. I grew up in town, but there's a national forest here. So, of course, we'd go out to the woods for this. And for me, metaphorically or allegorically speaking, like the face of God is sort of the push and pull of the texture on a rock face with a tree in front of it, where you focus on the tree branch and the pulsating reality of that tree branch, the rock face behind the tree branch, and then both together and back and forth. And everything is what it is, but it is also other things. For that sort of flow. And so, like, when we're trying to create, I think this is particularly aesthetically or formally embalmed, but also conceptually, for example, the wounded tools you mentioned, which is sort of reprojecting the human onto the tools, the reality of the living labor that created it with a realist story. So we have, like, for example, sickles that are covered in poems. And the story around the sickle is they were obsessed with Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass being sickles, but they weren't able to write their own poetry, so they attacked the public library and cut up all the poems in the public library. So that's on the wall, the story's there. And then that's in concert with a painting across the room of Alita beheading Elon Musk. And for me, I love that you brought up the Grange movement. For me, Locust is sort of like our art version of a Grange newspaper. And for us, I think, personally, Balm is our Grange Hall that we're trying to create. And part of that is having a space that is not a commodity. It's not exactly a commons because it's not held in common. We're doing it. But a space where you don't have to buy anything, it doesn't exist for money, and it doesn't exist for capital accumulation in any particular way. In fact, the opposite is sort of a negation of capital accumulation, which again projecting the human back into the commodity or the tool in a way. One of the ideas that we've had that we haven't really been able to do anything about was the idea of going to Dollar General stores and getting artifacts, quote unquote, commodities from the Dollar General store, and then like elevating those as art objects with narratives that sort of tell some kind of a realist story or history about whatever led to the creation of the artifact. So get like a really crappy bottle of dishwashing detergent, and then what is the actual like narrative, like psychologically or cosmically behind the dishwashing liquid that appears to us as a phantasmagorical commodity fetish. But Carbondale has a long history of those spaces, which is another reason we wanted to do it here. One of the longest continually running punk houses in the country is here in Carbondale, Lost Cross. They just had, I think, their 35th anniversary, I think it was. We didn't go because of COVID concerns and so on. And there used to be multiple punk houses here over the years that were really important to creating a counter community, counter morality to the mainstream bourgeois morality and sense of.
Yeah.
And they weren't perfect, but it was they were imperfect, and there were lots of problems.
Right.
But it was a place that provided some refuge, particularly for a lot of like queer kids from around this area who couldn't stay in a small reactionary town anymore.
Yeah, I grew up in a town without those spaces, so the idea of being able to like create even a small sort of one is really exciting to me, because holy shit, do people need it now more than ever.
Imago, our theory annual, Kira Wordsworth writes about the CHOP Autonomous Zone in Seattle, I believe, or is it Portland? Anyway, but through the lens of the carnivalesque, right? Like this explosion of subjectivity. And within capitalism, it's always imperfect. It has critical aspects, it has kind of reactionary aspects, it can be contradictory, and so on. So there can be this thing that threatens the status quo, but also reproduces it in those spaces. And I know this is one of the difficulties in creating these spaces, because on the one hand, it can be a refuge, but on the other hand, it's not like there's any guarantee that there won't be predators there, right? There is no guarantee that something bad will not happen, because these things don't exist separate from capitalism. They exist within capitalism and heterosexist, racist society. So on the one hand, it's this radical potential for the carnivalesque, this concept that comes from Mikhail Bakhtin's reading of Francois Rabelais' work, this idea of a chaotic totality jumbling against the established order, but it's always imperfect and fragmentary. So I always think of the progressive but also disturbing aspects of like that scene. I think it's in Hermanal, Emile Zola, when the women castrate the baker who has been in a riot, who has been basically, to give people food, extracting sexual favors and so on, if I'm remembering the story right. And so on the one hand, this is righteous gender and class revenge, but on the other hand, this is not a way to organize society, right? So the carnivalesque has a terrifying aspect to it, both because of its I think antipathy to the status quo, but it's also uncontrollable, and that raises other questions that when I say uncontrollable, I mean it's not necessarily perfect class consciousness.
But Tish, your work, they do that a lot. They bring out hidden feelings, more unarticulated thoughts that I've had, and you have a really wry sense of humor, like a great wit to your stories, and they include like objects that gain sentience, like sex bots or all sorts of things. What is your approach when writing a story? How did you stumble across this strange cybernetic surreal science fiction?
I've always kind of like identified with robots and monsters and aliens, partially because of like stuff that I went through when I was a kid, but also just because that's stuff that I've always been drawn to. Like my goth half is like, I get the things that are pushed aside and objectified, and I understand and identify with those things, and especially broken things. And I think that like the first story I ever wrote about a robot, I was like, well, if he's sentient, I'm not gonna I don't want to beat everyone over the head with the fact that he's a robot. Like, if he's sentient, then he feels like I feel, right? Like, that's how that word is defined. And I guess that sort of started me on the path of trying to sort of understand and give agency to characters that represent things that I haven't necessarily experienced, but sort of see parallels in, and it I don't know, that started me on the road of I don't want to shy away from gross stuff and and awful stuff, and as someone who started writing fan fiction to write, I decided that I was just going to approach this stuff as a fan fiction writer too. So I was going to take the different ways that I felt about cyborgs and aliens and use those to write stories and situations that I wanted to see from other working class people, and that I wanted other working class people to see in a story and be like, oh fuck yeah, that's amazing, I hadn't even considered that.
Oh, what was the fan fiction that you first started writing?
So I started writing almost entirely Harry Potter fan fiction, a little bit of supernatural, but that was mostly just reading and editing for other people. I was mainly writing Harry Potter fan fiction, and then from that, editing lots and lots and lots of fan fiction for people. I was completely unsatisfied with the way J.K. Rowling handled the story that she created, and that has not changed. And I think that at this point she's a garbage human being. But that thread of not being satisfied with what's going on around me, and so wanting to change it, but changing it in the only way that I actually have an ability to, at this point by myself, is just writing, right? So
it's sort of like fan fiction for reality.
Yeah, that's I think it's so interesting how popular fan fiction has become because of that, because there's youth today are growing up with this idea that no, I can change the story if I want to. I can make these characters fall in love. I can change the ending. I can give them this political ideology I want. I know there's ones out there like that, and it would be interesting to read Harry Potter.
Except everyone's queer and it takes place in the Soviet Union.
Oh my god, that would be so good.
And you know what? I would read Lenin and Trotsky Slash. So.
Oh fuck yeah.
Out there.
Well, I mean, this is another thing where there's like also reactionary versions of it, because there's this democratic impulse, and I can't remember the comrades. There was a German comrade that likes our work that he wrote a bunch of stuff on the democratic potential of fan fiction. But there's also a right-wing version of this, like around QAnon, and you've been researching this a lot, Tish. These stories about like how many times now has Hillary Clinton been secretly executed at Guantanamo Bay?
I think at least 6 that I have screenshots of.
They're making clones just to execute them.
Yeah, it's like that really bad Resident Evil movie. I actually liked the Resident. It was just that one where they kept cloning whatever Alice over and over again to kill her. It's like that with Hillary Clinton.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
Speaking of QAnon and stuff, though, that is an interesting one. I know there's a conversation, Adam, you and some others, Alexander, Holly, y'all had on Haymaker, with Haymaker Books, and you have a big discussion on QAnon. So I don't want to get into all of that there.
Sure.
But Holly kind of pushes back on this idea that it is irreal, and like she said, points out that it has this rationalizing aspect to it and stuff,
sure.
which I thought was interesting. But what I'm curious about is what my co-host Mike has talked about in his last book, The Memeing of Mark Fisher, is he kind of wishes for the possibility of a left QAnon. And I think by that he really means like the possibility of pushing forward an ARG type alternative reality type response, like a left response to that. And find that kind of interesting is like putting forward something that would be as engaging QAnon, but from a left-wing perspective. Of course, I think most of the problem there goes on they don't care too much about fact. You know, if we're building a socialist, you kind of have to have things, even if you're being still and psychedelic and all this, you do have to have facts for the world to actually work and run, to produce the food for people, etc. But what do you think about some kind of ARG game that, like, would it be possible to have an ARG game that leads to the revolution?
I would love for that to be possible, and maybe this is like some bitterness that I have over my dealings with the quote unquote left, but I just think they'd fuck it up. I just think they would absolutely research the shit out of every single tiny minutia, because that's how a lot of ARG games are ruined anyway. But like I don't know, I just feel like they'd ruin it. That's probably my bitterness, though.
Well, I think Holly is right about the experience of like the initial phase of QAnon when Q was still doing drops, in part, and that the way it was experienced was as an ARG. You got to follow the clues, figure it out. But the content was pretty irreal, right? Like, I liken it to, well, you think about Dungeons and Dragons, right, or an MMORPG. The content's real, but it's a very rational mathematical formula to determine what actually happens, right? There's a rolling the dice or the random number generators to determine what happens if you hit the boss in the right way in the dungeon or whatever. So I think Holly's right about part of the experience of it is this unearthing of truth or whatever. Although the truth is this irrealist, reactionary, occultist truth that's building on anti-Semitic mythology and so on. One of the things that's been discussed, and Tish has recorded a ton of stuff since the far right has been largely pushed off the mainstream platforms. They've been relocated on platforms like Telegram. And one of the ways that academics have described this as collective myth-making platforms. And I think that gets at what's happening now, maybe even a little bit more than the ARG. That people are collectively coming up with mythologies, and they're borrowing some stuff from the European kind of fascists, but rejecting, like, for example, frequently, like, the most overt anti-Semitism and so on, and coding it more, although that might be shifting, coming up with a mythology. And I think this goes back to this quote that we brought up from Andre Breton before: the left needs a myth to counter the myth of Odin. The left needs a myth to counter the far-right myth. But the nature of our myth has to be different, right? Because it can't lie, right? Not in the way that the right lies. Because for us, social context and actual solidarity is important. And that's why I think the Irrealism thing is so helpful. If you consider the culture that we produce and that we connect amongst our working class siblings as an expression of our own personal mythologizing in aggregation, right? It doesn't have to be true, but it can't claim, it might be true in the sense a myth is a truth for how to live in the world, but it's not a lie. It's not concealing. The right benefits from social media because of its decontextualization in a way that I think that we can't benefit from it. So I don't know if this begins to get what you're saying, but I think the nature of a left mythology has to be different than the nature of a right mythology, not just in terms of content, but but also in the sense that, like, an ARG for the left would actually be organizing a revolution, right? So we can imagine what that would look like. But we can't pretend, for example, that there's secret forces within the government that will carry it out for us, like you and I.
Right.
Like,
Yeah, very true.
Because it has to be class consciousness, right? But I think one of the things we can say is part of class consciousness is saying there's no contradiction between class consciousness and your individual dreaming, right? Like, one of the problems that I think I've had I remember this, just to give an example, I don't know if I brought this up before with y'all. I was at a study group years ago when I was a new Marxist, and an even newer comrade to the movement asked, would we have heroes under socialism? And my response to this was, we'll have heroes, but we'll have millions of them, right? And the older comrade, who was like, the established Marxist guy, was like, no, we just won't have heroes. And I thought this was a terrible way to look at it. Like, join the movement that will destroy heroes instead of join a movement that will make the entire human race in the long run heroes, right? And I think that that's kind of how I look at it, rather than, it's like your dreams, your psychology, your nightmares are all equally valued to everyone else's dreams, psychology, and nightmares, and are equally part of being class conscious. There's nothing opposed to your subjective value and the collective subjective value of all the exploited and oppressed. In fact, they're mutually reinforcing and necessary. And I think we're trying to express that in our work and in Locust Review. And I know that's in some ways impossible, because the only thing that will ever make that real is an actual socialist revolution. And I don't think I still don't believe that that's impossible. I think, one of the things we talk about is shooting the moon in the next editorial for Locust Review. We've probably taken too many tricks not to win any other way. But it's going to come down to a head. And I think if we just assume that we're defeated, we even could make the conditions of our defeat worse.
I want to amend my previous answer. I do still think the left would fuck it up, but I want to. So basically, I think if we wanted to create something like Q, it would have to look like. I don't want this to sound. It would have to look like Locust. I think it would have to be like lots of tiny, small, printed magazines, because like what Q still does is like baking. but since there aren't any more Q drops, they're just like taking the stuff that is pulled around from various QAnon supporters, and then it goes into a big channel and they all talk about it, and the stuff that like makes the biggest impact to what they're trying to accomplish is the stuff that gets disseminated. So that's not dissimilar from like what we're trying to do with Locust in a very, very vague way, which is take good content that is sent to us from working class people and then send it out to more working class people, right? And it's stuff that's art and emotional art and political art. So I think it would have to look like that, basically. I think if we wanted to make the impact that Q has made, but in a left-wing way, it would have to be lots and lots of tiny things like Locust, or even bigger, throwing stuff from our perspective out into the world constantly.
I was thinking while we were talking to you, what would an Irrealist, Critical Irrealist Q look like? And maybe it would be like a Bolshevik cosmos time traveler, and so on. Like, this is a thought experiment, like saying, like, listen, this is like what you guys have to do to make sure you get to the right future or whatever. But there's another problem, and that is the structure of the Q thing itself, right? That it's the subordination of a multitude to a single voice.
Right.
And we don't actually we want the opposite. We want the subordination of the bourgeoisie to the multitude. So that raises other questions, right? Like who designs the game if it's an ARG? And then you get back to the classical debates between Bakunin and Marx, Bakunin and Marx, about like, or Proudhon and Marx, about like what it takes to make an anti-capitalist revolution. Can it be a conspiracy, or does it have to be an open movement of the exploited and oppressed? So I think it might be an interesting aesthetic gesture to create a left Q, for sure. Might be fun to see what that does. Ultimately, we need like 10 million left Qs.
Well, it reminds me, a few years ago, I had strep throat and a sinus infection at the same time, and I had a 103-degree fever for 4 days. And when I woke up, when I finally like regained actual consciousness, I was in like the craziest fever dream. I looked at my notes a couple days later. I'd written something about how they didn't know how communism would win, and they didn't know it was coming. The revolution was the trapdoor that they all built. And I was like, what am I talking about in this thing? And it makes me think of is like, one starts playing this game, and then at the end of it, they didn't realize they somehow created, another society, except class consciousness in order for that reality. So you would have to know that you're playing. Locust Review 7 is now taking submissions. Where can people submit to? Is there a theme that they need to follow, or they just let their art speak for them?
Well, so the theme this issue is missing time, right? Missing time or missing days.
Something like that.
Yeah, and if anyone has any submissions, locust.review@gmail.com.
I mean, that's the theme we're like focusing on with the editorial, and it's sort of pivoting off like when like strikes are talked about, they describe that as lost days, even though it's gain days often for the workers on strike, but also about the trauma of capitalism, but also the pandemic and so on, and mourning and loss, because we have lost hundreds of thousands of working class people just in the U.S. alone. But of course, if people want to talk about, we are open to anything people submit. They don't necessarily have to be just along the lines of that theme or whatever. And I will say this: you were talking about your dream, Adam. I had an anxiety dream the other night, where I was working for some faceless bureaucracy, and I had to write prefaces like in a book, but for human beings. And if I didn't write the prefaces quickly enough or good enough, the people I had to write them for were killed. That's where I'm at mentally.
If you have been enjoying our content, please consider registering your desire with the algorithm by liking and subscribing. This really does help us grow and reach a wider community. If you would like to support our work of documenting and nurturing the rise of post-capitalist desires, become a patron. This allows us to continue research-based memes, podcasts, and videos, as well as up our production value. Patrons receive early views of videos, exclusive content, and more, including physical art and the ability to directly influence our research topics. The building of a better world happens on many fronts. Turn on, tune in, and shape a future collective reality.